We have for our reading from the Hebrew Scriptures today the story of Hagar and Ishmael, although it doesn't mention the name of Ishmael. It is Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham. And this story is shared with the Muslim tradition as well. It appears in the Quran and is mentioned in other parts of the Muslim tradition, and where sometimes there are distinct differences between our two traditions. On this particular story, it's really more a question of perspective, of different emphases, the same story basically told with different versions. In the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, Hagar originally is Sarah's slave and is offered to Abraham because Sarah had not had children to provide descendants for Abraham. In the Muslim tradition, Hajar, who's not mentioned in the Quran but mentioned elsewhere, is Abraham's slave, but is originally the daughter of Pharaoh in Egypt. So it's not simply a slave, but a pretty high-level person. And when I read about that, I wondered, there is that part in Genesis where Abraham and Sarah visit Egypt, and Abraham's worried that they'll kill him in order to get Sarah, so convinces Sarah to pass herself off as his sister, which she does, and Pharaoh takes her as a wife for a while until bad things start happening to Pharaoh, and he discovers the truth and gets angry at Abraham for it. I just wondered if maybe this was part of a trade or something that happened in Egypt, but no one mentions that. The impetus for the action in both stories is Sarah's jealousy. We heard last week when we read about the prophecy of the birth of Isaac that Sarah and Abraham were old. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah, it's clear from today's lesson, worried about this inheritance thing. Would the eldest inherit, or would her son? And she asks that Hagar be sent away. In the Quran, there's the jealousy, but Abraham takes Sarah away to the wilderness and accompanies her. In our version, she's sent away with food and water. In the Muslim version, she's left with no water and no food in a very dry place. She wonders about this and asks Abraham, did God ask you to do this? But when he says yes, she accepts that and is used as an example of faith. And Abraham too, when after he leaves them, prays for them. In our version, Hagar lays down Ishmael and goes away quite a ways so that she won't look on his death. She's a little more active in the Quran version. She runs between these two hills 7 times. I don't know whether she's looking for water or just in some kind of desperate grief, running. Both stories tell of an angel calling forth a spring, or pointing out a spring, or bringing forth a spring through the power of God that refreshes and saves the life of Ishmael and Hagar. In the Quran, our story ends there with saying there's these two families, kingdoms, peoples that come from Isaac and Ishmael. In the Quran, Ibrahim returns quite often to this other family that he has. And as Ishmael grows up, together he and Abraham build a shrine in the place where the water came up near the hills. And that place is Mecca. And the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, reproduces this scene. People run between the two hills of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa 7 times. There is the well Zamzam, that is the sacred well, and the shrine which Abraham and Ishmael built is the Kaaba at the center of the holy city there. We're in what's called year A of our scripture readings for the season after Pentecost, our long period of what's called normal time between Easter and Advent. And in this year, we'll be reading the story of the early formation of the people of our tradition, the Hebrew people coming from Abraham and Isaac. And we began last week with the story of Isaac's birth. Before that, we didn't read it because Trinity Sunday was later this year. The call of Abraham to leave and follow God. And these and the story that we have today are clearly reflections of history in a way. It's not the kind of history that we think of, which with dates and artifacts and proofs and such, but it's like a family history. We know we're related very closely to the Arab people, for example. The Hebrew people would say, and what is that relation? And the story's told of Isaac and Ishmael. So that was a way to talk about relationships, to talk about developments. And you have that throughout. We'll hear that throughout. We'll read from Abraham up to the point where Moses brings the people to the River Jordan just before going into the Holy Land. So it's interesting to read that. We can understand how far back somebody at the 8 o'clock service commented on how this division between Ishmael and Isaac is still with us today, at the source of so many of our issues. It's worth pondering. But as a part of our spirituality, as well as a part of our history in our tradition, these stories need to be read both historically and also spiritually, in an interior way, as a kind of interior metaphorical expression of the spiritual path, from the call to the journey, to the wilderness, the searching for water when we're thirsty spiritually, and on to the point when we may be brought to an entrance to a holy land. So I just suggest that you have that in your mind when hearing these stories this summer. This story, as I said and spoke about last week and have talked about before, is the story of Abraham leaving the city, leaving civilization. That the Fertile Crescent from the Nile Valley around to the Tigris and Euphrates was one of the major places where the human species took a turn in their development and developed irrigated agriculture, large-scale agriculture, division of labor, built cities, and had hierarchical governments. A huge change in the way that people live that has had ramifications that affect us very much today. there was something about that was spiritually questionable that's reflected in Abraham's calling to leave it, to wander for a while. Now, we have inherited the civilization. We've inherited the structures, the hierarchies, the values sometimes that Abraham questioned and set aside. So in a way, there's a conflict between our values and these values that we hear about in these stories. But there's another turning away that really isn't in conflict with our modern life, and that's the turn away from a mythological-oriented religion to a religion that's based on relationship and lived out in history. If you look at the stories in Genesis that come before the story of Abraham, stories of creation, story about the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, talks about giants on the earth, about Noah and the flood. All of these, in a way, are Hebrew versions of Mesopotamian or Canaanite mythology. They're toned down a bit from their what might be called pagan versions, but they're still a mythological way of thinking, which was inherent in the kind of life that developed around the Fertile Crescent and other places where civilization grew. Human species moved in a way from a kind of magical thinking to a mythological thinking. And part of that was a sense of being at the mercy of larger forces that we could not control. And either trying to propitiate them, to tie into the power that was represented by these myths, these stories, in one way or another, through sacrifices, rituals, prayers in some ways. Or they offered a place to hide. You could hide from the powers of the universe in the sacred precincts. You could find sanctuary in the temples from your enemies in the world. The shift to historical thinking, seeing the sacred meaning in one's own life as played out in relationships, discerning a call, is what comes after Abraham's call. And Christian faith and practice really make use of both types of spiritual thinking. Mythological thinking isn't something that was false and now our historical rational thinking is true. Mythology is just a way of being involved in the metaphors and symbols that arise for people. And it occurs although we don't admit it sometimes, in our focus on who Jesus was as a special holy person with a special birth and a special life, as Messiah, Redeemer, as God's Son, which is really a mythological concept of Jesus as an atoning sacrifice, paying a debt, as St. Paul might say, that we could not pay, so that there's this transaction between God and God happening in the life of Jesus that we tie into through propitiation, through prayer, through ritual, through mystical participation, to enhance our lives in some ways, to protect us, to heal. Or sometimes we try to hide in that, to cope with our daily failures and our worldly struggles in our faith. That's a point. That's the purpose, in a sense, of a mythology, to provide this overarching understanding or explanation for life and for our values and such. And I would rather follow the Christian mythology, the Christian understanding, than a mythology that is materialist Marxist, or is sort of a dog-eat-dog social Darwinism based on greed, which have been proposed as alternate way. I think the way of Jesus is a pretty good way. But we also, as Christians, don't just focus on who Jesus was, but what he did and what his life was. His breaking through barriers in his relationships with Gentiles and women and the poor and what were considered unclean people, and in his teaching of compassion, of connection with God and dependence on God. We have tried to discern as well how our lives are like the life of Jesus. How is God acting in us through our call? What is our call? What is the cross that we bear in life?